Hello, welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. I was going to go through the transits or Gochara from a Vedic Astrology or Jyotish perspective for August 2022. And part of what I'll be going through is actually current events related to World Health Organization, New York State, and the President of the United States. So let's get into it. A note before we do that though, the information presented here is for educational purpose only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And then I would take a minute or two to read through the rest of this disclaimer. So here's a summary for the dates where transits planetary transits are going to be happening in August 2022. So we're right at the tail end here, actually at the end of July, so 30th of July to 2nd of August. We're just kind of finishing up on this energy. Mars was in exact conjunction with Rahu. So Mars was crossing over Rahu in Aries or Misha. Misha is the Sanskrit term for Aries. And this is a big one. So actually, even though we're just sort of finishing up, I think it's going to have more long-term consequences, and I'll go through things that have already sort of come about because of this conjunction. On August 6th, Venus will be entering Cancer, or Karka in Sanskrit. On August 10th, we have a couple of things going on. Sun will be in exact aspect to Rahu, Mars, and Saturn in Ashlesha. It's a lunar mansion. And also on that day, Mars will be entering Taurus or Vrishabha. So we've got some fiery planets moving about. On August 11th, so right after that, there's going to be a full moon in Dhanishta aspecting the Sun and Venus in Cancer or Karka. Let's see. So then on August 16th, the Sun will be entering Leo. So just a few days later, where Sun will be in its own sign or Swa. August 20th, Mercury will be entering Virgo, its own sign, also called Kanya in Sanskrit. And then from the 23rd to the 26th of August, there's going to be 5 planets in their own Rashi or constellation. So there's going to be strength and perhaps some exaggeration of some of the planetary energies. And on August 27th, there will be a new moon in Maga that will be conjoining the Sun in Leo and with an aspect of Mars. And then at the very last day of the month, Venus will be entering Leo and conjoining a Swa Sun. So I would say that the big energies playing out this month are Mars and Sun, because those are going to be pretty much related to all the important transits going on this month. So let's talk about this first thing, even though we're at the sort of tail end of the technical aspect of this conjunction. I don't think it was insignificant in a lot of ways. So Mars was in exact conjunction, meaning that it was in the same degree as Rahu from July 30th to August 2nd. And so what does that mean? Like, how does that kind of play out in the world? Well, on July 23rd, so, in the week leading up to this conjunction, the World Health Organization declared monkeypox a public health emergency. I don't know if you got a chance to check out my transit video from last month, but I actually predicted that this time there would potentially be an outbreak of monkeypox and also a new wave of COVID, and so both of those things are happening, unfortunately, but you kind of see it coming about in the sky. So this chart here, if we take a look at it, this is the natural zodiac, and by natural zodiac what I mean is that Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, is in the first house position. First house, this is a northern Indian style chart, and so the first house is the top diamond right in the center there. That's considered the first house. And so when you put Aries in this first house, it's also considered the rising sign or ascendant or the lagna, if you want to use Sanskrit. These are all names different names for the same thing. So rising sign, ascendant, lugna. So I use those interchangeably. But when you put Aries in the first, kind of orient the chart so that Aries is in the first position, you're basically looking at sort of a global energy for the world. And so as we see here, I've circled in the blue, is that Mars is coming across. It's in 18 degrees, just past 18 degrees, and it's coming towards Rahu, which is about 24 degrees at the time of this. And the time of this chart was the 23rd of July. So you can see right at the top here, and the first house can be related to general health and kind of things that you see on the surface level of people or places or events. And we have Mars and Rahu together. So this is the conjunction that's sort of symbolizing the problems coming about because of these viral infections. So Mars can symbolize things like acute disease, inflammation, fiery type things. Yeah, even things like desire, libido. It can symbolize things like property as well, and anger. So mostly fiery things. And then Rahu and Ketu, they can symbolize things that are sudden, unusual, hidden, things like viruses, epidemics, mental health issues, and diseases that are hard to diagnose and treat. And so you have these two things together. So you can imagine with these two energies, you're going to get things that are like unusual diseases, acute diseases, unusual inflammation, unusual sudden outbreaks of things. And also Mars can represent things like men. And, again, Rahu can symbolize things that are unusual. And it seems like right now, at least so far, that the main population being affected by monkeypox is the gay male population. That's not exclusively true. It is affecting like women and children, all this sort of thing too. But if we put these two planets together and what they symbolize, you could come up with men who are unusual, and not so much like in a moralistic way, but just the fact that they're a minority. Last I checked, which was not recently, frankly, so this might be different, but last I checked, I think gay men or gay people generally, they make up about 10% of the population, but it depends on where you live. At some point in my life, I lived in San Francisco, where there was a higher percentage of gay men and women in that population. I think in San Francisco it was 30%, but that might have also changed as well. But again, even so, even with a larger percentage like that, they're still in a minority. So the other thing is that when we look at the aspects of these planets, so Mars will aspect or shine its energy 4 houses away. So you can see the first red arrow here is pointing towards the Sun and Mercury in Cancer. And also Mars will shine its energy directly opposite it in the 7th house where Ketu is. And then it will shine its light 8 houses away, and you'll see the 3rd arrow going into the sort of lower right corner. There's a little 8 at the top. That's actually 8 represents the 8th sign of the zodiac, or Scorpio. And so what's interesting to me as I look at this is that if you consider the symptoms of monkeypox, what's kind of coming through is that people are seeing lesions like on the mouth and the face, which is represented by the 1st house, which is where you see that circled Mars and Rahu together. And then they're also seeing lesions, sort of like in the genital urinary area, like the anus and that sort of thing, which is represented by the 8th house, which is where this Mars-Rahu energy is being directed in this global chart. So that's interesting to me. There is, again, also this respiratory function. So it can be spread with long contact, prolonged contact through respiratory droplets. And the lungs are represented by the 4th house, which is where Mars is shining its energy into Cancer, where the Sun and Mercury are. The thing though is that also in here, Jupiter is shining its energy into this 4th house. And Jupiter is in its own sign, so it's very strong. And it's the great benefic. So it's going to sort of soften the blow. So I think that's why, so far in the media, what we're hearing about are like the lesions on the face and the lesions in the genital urinary area. So it's kind of interesting that this is playing out here. The other thing, the 7th house is important because The seventh house represents relationships, especially like one-on-one partnerships and things like that. So obviously, because so far, again, this will probably change over time as this thing starts to spread. But initially, the big kind of epicenters of spread were, I think, raves, where there was a lot of like, I don't know, either group sex or anonymous sex or something like that. But the thing is people become more concerned about this, it's going to change relationships, and the public health authorities are trying to encourage people to be more discerning about who they engage sexually with. So that's going to change things like that, relationships. The other thing is that the fourth house, besides representing medically the lungs, it represents the home. So you can also see that as this disease starts to spread, people are going to be more concerned about how they keep their home, and how they clean it, and the contact that they have in their home, because again, this thing can spread through things like clothing and bed sheets as well. The eighth house also, besides representing medically the genitourinary area, it's also a house of like secrets, and it's also a house of like hidden things and hidden psychology. And so again, because this so far, at least the media is sort of sending out messages about how like so far it's mostly gay men who are affected by this, although not exclusively, that and because it's mostly sexually related so far, at least what we're hearing, this isn't going to be something that people are going to be really vocal about, probably. They're going to keep it hidden, and they're going to keep it private. So, almost like the AIDS epidemic, which I was actually on the front line of that, working with in AIDS research out in San Francisco, 30-something years ago, when that was a big thing. And, that was another epidemic that, didn't get nearly as much media attention as the other epidemic we're currently in, which is COVID. So let me just make sure that I've covered all the notes here. So Saturn is also involved here. Excuse me. And Saturn is, it's going to change things. So Saturn is retrograde in its own sign. Saturn is a planet that represents things like chronic disease, neuromuscular issues, anxiety, fear. Saturn represents privacy, structure, and also property. So, and this planet is shining into the seventh house as well. So you can see again that not only is there going to be the sort of like acute, short-term effect on relationships, but probably it's going to shift things quite a bit in terms of how people relate. Because again, we're still on the kind of beginning stage of this, and unfortunately, it looks like more and more people will be affected, and it's going to go around. So we need to be prepared for that. And I talked about first house, fourth house, seventh house, eighth house. Yeah, so again, this was the sky pattern and the planetary energies that were present when the World Health Organization declared monkeypox a public health emergency. So here we are. I had to start the recording again because I had to sneeze. But anyway, so this is a few days later, and this is when New York State actually declared monkeypox a state of emergency, and this is on July 29th, so just a few days ago. And this first chart here is in the morning, in the evening, 10:16 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and this is when the New York governor tweeted out a declaration that monkeypox is now considered a state of emergency in New York. So let's look at this chart. Again, a lot of arrows and things, but let's go through it one by one. So as you can see here, now the rising sign is 12th sign, or Pisces. But Mars and Rahu have shifted over to the second house, so it's up in the upper left side now. And it's basically broadcasting its energy across what we consider the 2-8 axis. So this Rahu-Mars energy is still broadcasting all this energy into the 8th house. Again, genitourinary area, secrets, sexuality, hidden things, that sort of thing. It's also broadcasting its energy onto Cancer, which at the time was containing Sun, which can represent government, Mercury, which represents communication, and Moon, which represents public. So all of a sudden, you get this like communication or counsel, basically, because the fifth house represents counseling. You get this counseling coming from the government about public, a public message about health. So that's interesting. And again, Saturn has shifted up a bit. So Saturn is now shining its energy into instead of the seventh house into the eighth house. So that's also going to cause an infrastructure change, because again, Saturn is super strong right now. It's retrograde. It's in its own house. So it's not just going to be a temporary situation here. This is actually probably going to have long-term effects. So it's just interesting to see how that turned out. And then I kind of just intuitively I was like, well, what does the birth chart of New York State look like? Because the thing is, when we look at transits, you'll see a lot of people talking about transits and stuff like that. And again, these planets are always spinning around, but they're not always significant, frankly. And they are significant, though, when they're recreating planetary combinations in the natal chart, and they're also more significant when you're actually going through the planetary period that involves the planets involved. So I just wanted to see, is anything being reactivated in New York State? So the best I could find is that the birth chart of New York State is based on the 26th of July in 1788 in Poughkeepsie, but there's not an exact birth time. So what I did was I spun the chart so that the moon was in the top spot. So this is basically what we call the Chandra, or the moon lagna, which is second best. Again, if you can get a constellation-based rising sign, that's best, because the constellation changes every 2 hours, and the moon changes signs every few days. So since the rising sign is faster, it's a more specific read on the energies. So in any case, you can, as a second sort of, not first approximation, but second approximation, spin the chart and put it in the rising sign area and kind of read from there. So when I did that for the New York State birth chart, look at what we have here. Well, we have Ketu and Rahu. So these, they're still on the 2-8 axis. So they're actually recreating energies here. Hello. So this is why these planetary transits are affecting New York State. In this case, though, Mars is in the 5th house. But because it aspects 4 houses away, it is transmitting its energy to the 8th house again. So, again, this 8th house is getting bombarded by this Rahu Ketu energy and Mars. And then looky here, we have Saturn retrograde in its own sign, not Capricorn in this case, but in Aquarius. So, because Saturn broadcasts this energy 3, 7, and 10 houses away, it is also shining its energy into the 8th house. So literally, we do have a recreation of this Rahu, Ketu, Mars, Saturn energy in the 8th house. And so I was like, wow, well, there must have been something big, going on about that time. So I did a little bit of research, again, not too deep, but just to see, was there anything going on at this time? And I found this article called The Enduring City by J. Barr. Was written by J. Barr, and I found it in the Cine Journal. And they were just listing, kind of cataloging all the epidemics and crises that New York has experienced through its, 250-year almost history, since it became a state. Because July 26, 1788 is when New York State accepted the U.S. Constitution and became, I think, the 11th state in the Union. But this article was really interesting because apparently there have been 27 epidemics just in the first 100 years in New York State. And there's been, on average, a crisis, some sort of crisis, whether it was a health crisis or a natural disaster or so, terrorism act or something, like one every 3 years. So there's been 140 like legitimate significant crises in New York like since its inception, okay? And it makes sense because again, you have this you have basically this cross and this layering of Rahu Ketu energy, Mars and Saturn all together. And when you have these things, just like I talked about last month, you can have things like floods and earthquakes and epidemics and just, because basically you have these really, forceful, groundbreaking energies like Mars, Rahu, Ketu with Saturn. So it's literally like you're disrupting normal flows, normal patterns, normal structures. So within the birth chart of New York State, embedded within it is this energy of like always being sort of on edge, like always sort of potentially like an earthquake, like ready to happen. That's the energy of New York State based on what I found. And so the other thing is the 8th house, which is, again, this big green circle, capturing this energy of Rahu, Ketu, Mars, and Saturn, and recreating what's currently in the sky. Besides sort of having this sort of like physical earthquake energy embedded, it's also going to be a physical earthquake of psychology, because this 8th house where the green circle is also represents not only sexuality, like the genital urinary area medically, but the deep psychology. And so, people talk about when they go to New York, like people are always kind of on edge, and so that's part of the energy here. So I found that really interesting. Oh, and also specifically in 1788, the one crisis that was going on was apparently there was this huge fire, and the phrase that they used in this journal article I found was that most of the city was basically burnt and rubble, and it stayed that way until the war ended. The article, again, the name of that is The Enduring City, because again, it's New York, has gone through so many crises and stuff like that. But you can see from the birth chart of the state that that's kind of the natural tendency, of the state. So it's just interesting to, bring this back home as to like, why is New York, like, why not Kansas City? And this is potentially the reason why, because we're recreating the sky pattern of when New York State was created. So also in the last few days, so just a day later, President Biden retested positive for COVID. And that was also potentially very interesting. So I've talked about the U.S. birth chart in the last, I think, couple months. So I brought that up again, and that's the first chart here. And based on July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at 5:10 p.m. This is the birth chart of the United States. It's a Scorpio rising. And this may not be entirely accurate. I haven't gone through the process of deep rectification, but this chart seems to work. And so what's interesting is that, again, if you look at the USA birth chart, you are getting a recreation of these energies again. So what's interesting here is that you do have Saturn aspecting onto Mars, and you do have Mars aspecting onto Saturn. So Saturn and Mars are in what we would call a super sambandha. Their energies are really combined. So you're always going to have this drive. Usually when you have Mars and Saturn together, you get things like athletes, and because Mars is sort of the initiation factor, and Saturn is like the perseverance and endurance factor. And let's see. And then the other thing is Mars is broadcasting its energy not only onto Saturn but to Ketu. So that means that Mars and Ketu are also in a linkage here. So their energies are combined. So, not quite as exact or as obvious as in the New York chart, but in the USA birth chart, you do have this basically Mars, Saturn, Rahu, Ketu mix that is being recreated. So again, because you're recreating energies that are in the birth chart, that's why the current transits may be more significant. And then the second chart here, this was at 15:20 p.m. on July 30th. And I just cast this chart right when I heard the news that President Biden retested positive. And it just so happened, I didn't switch the chart. It just so happened this chart was also a Scorpio, Lugna, Ascendant, Rising, whichever term you want to use. So you can actually, because it's the same rising sign or Lugna as the United States, you can almost consider this like an update chart, or what you call a Samaya chart for the United States. So you can see them side by side. And so if we look at the Samaya chart, now we switch things up a bit. Now we have Mars in its own sign with Rahu in the 6th house of acute disease. It's shining, broadcasting. Mars is broadcasting its light into the 1st house. So it's general health and well-being. The other thing is that, what I saw was that this Mars and Rahu combination, Mars is aspecting this combined energy onto the 9th house. So you can see this green circle here. It's in Cancer with Mercury and Sun. So the 9th house represents the father, government, authority, the guru, teacher, that sort of thing. And the Sun is there. So when we have a chart where the Sun is in the 9th house, so you have the planet representing the father in the house representing the father, you might think that, oh, that sounds great, everything's lined up. But actually, that can be problematic because it's almost like there's too much energy there. And so when we find people or charts of people, places, things, events where the Sun is in the 9th house, that can indicate that there's actually issues or problems with the father. And so if we see this as extrapolate this as like an update chart for the United States, this could potentially mean that the father of the country is having a bit of trouble, which, here we go, President Biden retests positive for COVID. There is some positive influence here. So Jupiter is retrograde in its own sign. Again, Jupiter's the great benefic. That's really great. It's in a positive, what we consider a positive house or bhava, and it's shining its light 5 houses away onto this. So that should be some beneficial effect. The other thing is that this purple arrow back and forth, the Sun is in Cancer and the Moon is in Leo. So Moon is in Sun sign and Sun is in Moon sign. So what that means is that we call it a parivartana, and there's an exchange of houses. So that actually strengthens both planets. That helps. But the thing is, again, we have this super strong Saturn in the 3rd house in this orientation of chart. It's retrograde, it's in its own sign. It aspects 3 houses away. So this massive Saturn, which indicates things like delays and chronicity and endurance and stuff like that, it's actually suppressing the positive effects of Jupiter. So Jupiter is as beautiful as it looks, there's actually a drawback here. It's being suppressed by Saturn. The other thing is Saturn is shining all of this energy onto the 9th house, where this Mercury and Sun are right now. So, again, when you have Mars aspecting the 9th house and Saturn aspecting the 9th house, again, Mars represents acute disease, Saturn represents chronic disease. It made me think, it made me kind of wonder, what's so far in the media, they're showing or saying that, he's doing well and he's being followed and all this kind of stuff. But I think just yesterday they printed that his cough has returned, he's having a rebound effect from the medicine he's on. So what did I do with that? Well, the thing is, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, I didn't find an exact birth time for him. His birth time, I think, is 8:30 in the morning or evening or something, but it's based on memory. So it's not an exact birth chart. So by not being an exact birth chart, I won't have access or be able to use the sub-zodiacs to kind of verify, things and, in terms of how this might be affecting Biden long term. But I thought an indirect way to see, in terms of the president's health and the administration of the country, I decided to look at Kamala Harris's chart because she's vice president of the United States. And not to be morbid here at all, but, if Biden for some reason is mildly or severely incapacitated by COVID, which is a possibility given his age, then things are going to change for her. So this is kind of a backdoor, kind of a little bit of a sneaky, kind of indirect way of seeing how Biden's health might be affecting the United States government or the position of the President of the United States. So this is Kamala Harris's chart. She was born October 20th, 1964 in Oakland, California at 21:28 p.m. And okay, so this is her chart. In the top diamond here, this is the rising sign. This is the third sign of the zodiac. So she's a Gemini rising. And look at what we have here. We have Rahu in the top here. Rahu can indicate things like ambition, which she is, right? I mean, she's fairly young woman, and she's vice president, first one of ethnicity, and first woman in the vice presidency. So, good for her. But let's see. In her chart, what's also interesting is that I think the most important thing from her chart related to her work arena is that this blue circle here in the lower right corner, she has Saturn retrograde in Aquarius. So she has this massive Saturn in the 9th house. When you have a standout bhava like that, like a really super strong bhava like that, it can indicate career choices and career directions, but specifically the 9th house, because usually the first, when you think career, when you're analyzing a chart from Vedic Astrology, you first go to the 10th house, because that's kind of traditional career. Sometimes you go to the 7th house, which is more independent business type career. Sometimes you look at the 3rd house as more sort of like trade-oriented type jobs. But the 9th house, when the 9th house is related or standout bhava, standout house, or it's related to like the 10th house, and that can indicate that somebody benefits through working for the government. And she has this massive Saturn in the 9th house, so it's not surprising that she ended up working in government. Also here we have, again, another Parivartana. Well, she has two Parivartanas, two exchanges of houses. So her moon is in Aries, or in a Mars sign, and Mars is in moon sign. So you can exchange Mars and moon, so they're going to be very strong. She also has Venus and Sun sign, and Sun and Venus sign, so you can exchange these. So Venus and Sun are going to be very strong. So yeah, I mean, she's, and this is her chart. So then I was like, okay, right now Saturn is transiting through her 8th house, psychology and that sort of thing, and Jupiter is retrograde in its own house in the 10th house for her right now. So that could mean like very much like an expansion of duties, job responsibilities, that sort of thing. Okay, so when we bring the current transits in here, so it doesn't necessarily recreate right now her natal position of these planets, but the thing is that Saturn is currently in Capricorn, so for her that's going to be the 8th house, but it's going back into Aquarius in the middle of January. So by the middle of January, she is going to recreate this massive Saturn that's in the 9th house of, again, government and authority. So I was like, oh, okay, so that's around the corner. So then I was like, okay, well, let's look a little bit deeper for her. So I looked at the sub-zodiacs, or the amshas, they call it, or the micro-zodiacs, so different names for the same thing. So I looked at 2 amshas for her, 2 micro-zodiacs for her. The first one was the D10, which was considered the career amsha. I also looked at the D11, which usually people look at for income, but it can also indicate things like awards, and this is a place that you would look at to kind of look at, potentialities for somebody in elected positions. So I looked at the D10 and I looked at the D11. And then the other thing that's important here is to see, again, what, current planetary period, or they call it a Dasha period, she's currently in. So again, we have to line up transit and planetary period to see if there's anything significant going on here. She is currently, as of this recording, and it's, I think, August 3rd today, 2022, she's currently in Rahu, Mercury, Jupiter. Interesting. So, and actually, I think she started her Rahu period. I think that's when she was nominated for, was it that? She got nominated for the vice presidency before the election, or Rahu, or maybe it was Rahu was reactivating the natal, maybe that was it. But I know Rahu was like a big player whenever she got nominated for the vice presidency before the election, or it was like Rahu was recreating its natal position. I think that was it in her rising sign. But in any case, she's in Rahu, Mercury, Jupiter right now. She entered that period in thereabouts like 23rd of April this year, so the last few months. And the thing is, she's switching, periods on August 25th, so this month, and she's going to be switching into Rahu, Mercury, Saturn. So potentially this massive, massive Saturn is going to be lit up. Okay, so if we look at the D10 here, so this is the upper right chart. If we look at these planets here, so Rahu is well placed. It's in the first house. Mercury is in the seventh house. It's well placed. And Jupiter, it may not seem like it's well placed because it's in the eighth house. The eighth house is considered a negative house. But again, we have another parivartana, or exchange of houses. So Jupiter is in Saturn sign and Saturn is in Jupiter sign. So when you can kind of shift, exchange these planets, and that makes them in their own house and gives them a primary strength. So, and the thing is, that's also going to connect the 10th house of career with the 8th house of kind of psychology. The other thing is that when you find planets in the 3rd or 8th house of a zodiac, that can indicate times of change or endings. So right now, and then until mid-January, hello, does that sound, we were just talking about mid-January, her 10th house in the career subzodiac is going to be supercharged between Jupiter and Saturn for the next, basically, what is it, almost 6 months. So that was interesting. So I was like, okay, there could be something there. And, I could see something like, so far, my impression she's been in office for about 2 years now. My impression is that she's actually been fairly quiet. Like every once in a while you hear about her going on some international trip or something like that. Or maybe more significantly, she's breaking a lot of ties because the Senate's more or less even, Democrat, Republican, or whatever. But with these sorts of combinations coming up, there's I think a very good chance that she's going to become more prominent or take on more responsibilities, or, maybe head up more things. I don't know if it's going to be something new, or maybe potentially if Biden is having difficulty because it's going to be tough for him to recover fully from COVID, she may kind of step up. Okay. So then I was just like, okay, well, I don't want to assume too much here because that's going to be a big, surprise for everybody. But that's kind of the energy that's going on right now in the sky. But then when I looked at the D11, so again, this subchart, in the bottom right part here, again, income awards, elected positions. So again, right now she's in Rahu, Mercury, Jupiter. So Rahu in the first house. So again, this is like public persona, public image, the self, that sort of thing. So she's been gangbusters again, as being more prominent and being out there, worldwide. Mercury is in a positive sign. It's in the 11th house of clubs, groups, societies. So, she's definitely been networking. And Jupiter, so Jupiter, again, this is like a well-placed graha or planet in the first house. So that looks good for her. when she moves into Rahu, Mercury, Saturn, so again, we're going to move from this Jupiter energy in the first house to Saturn is in the 12th house for her. So the 12th house represents things like foreign places, places of isolation, expenses, loss. So she may have a bit of a difficult time at the end of this month, August, until she shifts into the next period, and again, middle of January. So again, if maybe not in public, like maybe the media is still portraying like, oh yeah, Biden's totally 100% capacity, she may behind the scenes picking up more projects and responsibilities because he may not be fully able. Okay. And then check this out. So then middle of January, January 20th, 2023, she's going into Rahu Ketu. So you know, Rahu and Ketu, again, are in the first house here in her D11, and Ketu is in its own sign. Ketu is considered the owner of Aries. They mostly use that in the sub-zodiac analysis, not necessarily the natal chart analysis. But in her chart, her D11 chart, Ketu, in its own sign, in the first house, that's probably the best placed planet for her. So it just seems like she's going to go, like, the next few months may be a bit rough for her. You know, maybe a bit of a drag or, you know, that sort of thing. But she's going to be, you know, probably at her peak. And she's going to be in this Rahu Ketu period until 7th of February 2024. So that's almost the end of Biden's term, you know, again, if he stays in office. So I was just like, you know, there's a possibility that she could really be stepping up and taking on more responsibilities. And again, I'm not sure because I haven't looked at Biden's chart because he doesn't have an exact birth time. I don't know how much, to what extent his health will be affected or a motivation for this, but it seems like she's going to be stepping up. Now, the thing is, she's moving into Rahu Venus, 7th of February 2024. So she's going to be shifting into Venus, you know, away from this K2 and Jupiterian energy and Saturn energy. A few months, you know, about 6 months or so before the next presidential election. And for her, I mean, her Venus is well placed in her natal chart. It's well placed in her D10 career sub-zodiac and her D11, you know, income awards and elected position zodiac. But it's not as strong as where it's currently, you know, the planets that are currently lighting up here. So even though she may be doing well, you know, I'm curious. You know, again, I didn't get into the next presidential election. I would want to wait and see, you know, who else is on board and if she's in the mix, you know, who else she might be up against. But the thing is also in the D11 here, you know, again, Venus is well placed, but it's not as well placed as the planet she's currently going through. So it may be, relatively speaking, like still great, but still a relative dip for her. The other thing is that on the D11, where you can assess elected positions, Venus is being aspected by Jupiter. And when you do Amsher sub-zodiac analysis, Jupiter is considered the sole enemy of Venus. So that kind of gives me, that kind of, and the thing is, in the sub-zodiac, the 9th bhava, or the 9th house of, again, government, is, the owner of that is Jupiter. So when you have the sole enemy of Venus broadcasting its energy on it, it makes me think that enemies are going to start coming out of the woodwork to work against her. And so I don't know how that's going to affect the next election, but it may not be great. But again, you know, I haven't gone down that rabbit hole of assessing the next presidential election, but, you know, again, I'm just looking at like how the energies are fluctuating, and I'm like, that may be a tougher time for her. You know, when you get closer to the next presidential election. But the you know, the kind of the summary or kind of nutshell version of the next few months is that I think she's going to become more prominent and taking on more responsibilities. Next few months are going to be a strain, but we might be seeing more and hearing more about Kamala Harris, again, perhaps related to Biden's health status. So let's see. The other thing is that when I was putting these slides together, again, it's kind of funny. I mean, I probably am learning more history by looking at the astrology than when I took all my history classes, but, in high school. But, it just occurred to me. So again, getting back to this whole, when we have Mars, Rahu, Saturn, some sort of combination going on, it just occurred to me, like, there's probably other significant moments in U.S. history where that was important. And intuitively, I was just like, oh, let me look at this date. So you might guess, if you're a history buff, this chart is based on November 22nd, 1963, 12:30 in the afternoon, Central Standard Time in Dallas, Texas. So this is a pretty significant moment in U.S. history. This is actually the moment that JFK, or John F. Kennedy Jr., I believe he was the 35th president, he was shot while he was going on a parade through Dallas, Texas. And, just somehow that's how we call it the Jyotir, and that's sort of the kind of presiding universal intelligent energy of Vedic astrology. It's kind of interesting that this just this is the only date that came to mind, and I just looked at it, and let's look at the energies here, but it's looking pretty similar. Yeah, it just blows my mind sometimes how this all comes together. So in this chart, Saturn is in its own sign. Hello, that sounds familiar. In this particular case, Capricorn is the rising ascendant Lagna, so that's going to be pretty prominent. And look at here, so that's recreating the current Saturn in its own sign in Capricorn. And look what we have here, Jupiter's retrograde in its sign of Pisces. Exactly the same. Saturn is broadcasting its energy on Jupiter, so it's suppressing the benefic effects of Jupiter. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, okay? So where's Saturn and Rahu and Ketu? So Mars, in this orientation of the chart is in the 11th house, clubs, groups, societies, that sort of thing. And when we look at its energies, it's shining, 4 houses away, 7 houses away, and 8 houses away. When it's shining its Mars energy 8 houses away in this chart, guess what it's aspecting? It's aspecting Rahu. so again, you have this admixture of Mars Rahu energy. And I was just like, wow, just blew my mind. The other thing is that I drew this red circle here because this combination of Venus, Mars, Mercury, Sun, again, Mars is in its own sign, so Mars is going to be powerful. But Mars is within a degree of Venus. So we would call this planetary war. We only call things planetary war when things are within a degree of each other if they're considered a true planet. So the true planets are, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Sun and Moon are not considered true planets. They're considered luminaries because there's a moon and a sun, right, a star. And then Rahu and Ketu, they're actually shadow planets. They're not actual planets. They're calculations of where, the shadow of Moon and the Sun interact or intersect. But when Venus and Mars, and the thing is that Mars is actually the winner because there's a winner. Venus is the winner, which is a benefic planet. So Mars is going to be hugely destabilized. Plus, if you look at their degree, they're at 28.6 degrees and 27. So in the next day or two, these planets are going to be shifting signs. Whenever a planet shifts signs, it becomes destabilized. So Mars is hugely destabilized by this planetary war. And it's also aspecting, again, Sun. So again, government, father, authority, king. These are things that the Sun symbolizes. So I was just this really kind of just blew my mind. Again, my interest was oh, let's look at the day JFK, got shot. And then here we are with slightly different configuration, but you still have these planets, the similarities are uncanny. So, that was a hugely significant event in U.S. history. So you kind of get, the flavor of these sorts of like lineups. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. What else is going on in August? Because that's just like the last few days. So let's talk about Venus transits. Venus switching signs twice this month on August 6th. So in a few days, Venus is entering Cancer, or Karka is a Sanskrit name. Cancer is, because it's ruled by the moon, is considered an enemy sign for Venus. It doesn't act as well. And the thing is, Venus and moon are both involved in things like the arts and fashion, sensuality, and you can be like kind of moody or gooey a bit. So this photo that I found, sort of luxuriating a spa in sort of like a private way and like getting all the feels and that sort of thing, being a bit more introverted. That's kind of the vibe that Venus is going to be in for most of the month. But then at the end of the month in August 31st, Venus is entering Leo or Simha, and it's going to conjoin a Swa sun. So Sun is going to be in its own sign. It's going to be very strong, and Venus is kind of joining the party there. Leo, because it's ruled by the Sun, it's considered an enemy sign for Venus. Again, it's not going to do its best here. But when I think about like Venus joining like a hugely strong Sun, house, because Sun it's like the king, right? It's like showy, it's fiery, it's like larger than life. Like when you get these two things, like I start thinking about things like large showy bling, and I specifically, like the image that came to mind was like Beverly Hills, for example. I mean, that's not an area of subtlety, right? I mean, it's gorgeous in its own way, but it's not exactly about subtlety, and it's not, it's kind of in your face, right? So that's going to be a bit of the energy here. So we're going to be moving out of this more like kind of sensitive, moody, quiet, listening type energy to just like loud and proud. So again, Elle Woods in the movie Legally Blonde. And you can see like a photo here from one of the posters from where she's just like, she's out there in her like Barbie core, full on hot pink. Even her dog is wearing hot pink. She's got the pink. I think her dog wears like this, chunky jewelry. Like it's just like, that's Venus in like Leo with the Sun, its own lord, and, all going on. You can also think of like Venus as the arts and Leo as a stage. So this might be like, if you're an artist, you might be bringing out to the forefront, like demonstrating it, displaying it for people. So instead of you just kind of working on it at home, you're kind of sharing it with like more people. And Venus also represents women, and the Sun represents leadership and government. So this also kind of like, ding, ding, ding in my head. I was like, oh, well, I was just looking at like Kamala Harris, and what's going to go on for her in the next few weeks and months. So we might also be seeing women stepping up in leadership, not just Kamala Harris, and the government in various ways. So the Sun transits, we got a few here in August. So on August 10th, the Sun is going to be in exact aspect to Saturn, Mars, and Rahu. So the Sun is going to be right in the crossfires of all this Mars, Saturn, Rahu, Ketu energy I've been talking about mostly. It's going to happen when the Sun is in Cancer, which is a friendly sign to Sun, so that's nice. The thing though is that the Sun is going to be in a Shlesha Nakshatra. Nakshatra means lunar mansion, so every day the moon, as it travels through the sky, is going to be in a different lunar mansion, and there are 27 lunar mansions. So this chart was when the Sun was the exact degree as Rahu Ketu. So again, it's right in the line of fire of this cross of energy. And these are all malefics. So you're getting literally all the malefics like in this like cross pattern of energy. So getting back to Ashlesha though, the symbol of Ashlesha is a coiled snake. And so it can have this energy of like a wily, creepy, like attention seeking. I tend to see Ashlesha a lot with like actors, actresses, models, like people who like attention and need attention, like professionally even. And I've also seen that when a Shlesha shows up, you can have sudden, like, almost like snake by a dish type things and painful separations. So, for example, Whitney Houston, for example, has an important planet or planets in a Shlesha, and she was definitely, like, in the limelight. And, the other thing is that, unfortunately for her, she died and this is what I find sometimes when the planets in a Shlesha light up, is that you can get, like, sudden unexpected events that are just wild. So she ended up passing away by, like, drowning in a bathtub in a hotel or something. I mean, just like, wow, unexpected. And another person that comes to mind is Kobe Bryant. He's a basketball star. And when he had a planet in a Shlesha, and when he moved into that period and the planet shifted signs, he suddenly died in, like, a helicopter crash. Like, just, bizarre things, sudden snake bites. So just, I don't know, I always kind of watch out for a Shlesha. And it can have this kind of dual, it can have dual kind of energy where it's this sort of, like, mesmerizing, seductive, the snake entwining you, drawing you in, because usually when snakes are around, a lot of people will just stare at them, they're pretty mesmerizing. But it can also, like, represent things like medicine, like the caduceus with the snakes winding up the staff. So sometimes when I see a Shlesha too, I find people who are not just involved in sort of, like, attention, important careers or functions or whatever, but they might be involved in professionally, like as a healthcare professional, or they might be a patient where they have a lot of medical issues or even drug issues. So Shlesha is like a interesting nakshatra. So the thing is, the sun medically represents the heart. And so, I don't know, the sun in a Shlesha, if we're looking for sudden unexpected events related to the heart, this could be something related to the heart. And again, the sun also represents the father and government. So, unfortunately, this might mean, like, kind of a big jolt, along those lines. So we'll see what the next few days brings about. And again, you do have this, like, Swa retrograde Jupiter aspecting onto this, but you have this Swa retrograde Saturn suppressing the benevolence and the softening effects of Jupiter. So it's still going to be a question mark, I think, as to how things play out. And then on August 16th, the sun enters Leo, Simha, its own sign. So in its own sign, a planet's considered Swa, or very powerful, having primary strength. So that's good, potentially, for many things. But there's a caveat to that, and that the caveat is that when a planet is Swa in its own sign, it doesn't necessarily protect people or issues related to medical things. So it will help with non-living things. So it may help with the government. So there may be a shifting of, stabilization of the government, but it wouldn't necessarily mean for Biden that, since he's in that position, that he will be more stable potentially. But again, I haven't looked at his chart. But, again, I'm just sort of like, sort of like the sleuth here, trying to put pieces together and make some sense of, how this is all coming together. And then we also have Mars-Mercury transits on August 10th. So again, this is right about the time when I was just showing you the cross pattern of Sun, Rahu, Ketu, Mars, and Saturn. If you look at that, if you look at Mars and the degree of Mars, Mars is just about to switch signs. So that means that Mars is going to be even more unstable. And that's all we need is more instability, right? So anyway, Mars is going to enter Taurus, or Vrishabha. And Taurus is ruled by Venus. This is a neutral sign for Mars. It does okay. But Taurus is an earthy sign. So Mars is moving from fire or enthusiasm, passion, action to earth. So, like, getting grounded. Getting practical. So you can kind of imagine, like, Mars moving into Taurus is that it's kind of this idea of, like, planting new seeds. So there's still this newness and there's still this action, but it's more grounded, And then August 20th, Mercury enters Virgo, its own sign, or Kanya. And it's going to be in its own sign, so swa, so strong. And Virgo is also an earth sign. So, and Mercury is very detail oriented. So when I see Mercury entering Virgo, and for the northern hemisphere here, and probably some of the other hemisphere too, I just think of fall. So that's different. But like, when kids go back to school, the end of August, September, and you have to like get all their school supplies, and you have to, create a new school schedule and all this sort of thing. I always think of like Mercury enter Virgo, which is about this time of year when Mercury does that. So it sort of lights up this whole Virgo energy of being detail oriented, but also like an organizing, grounded, like a very practical, grounded organization. So that's going to be happening August 20th, just in time for school kids and parents. And so when you take these two together, again, Mercury was in Leo, which is a fire sign. Mars was in Aries, a fire sign. And both of them are moving from fire signs to earth signs. So again, it's this energy, combined energy of enthusiasm and passion, translating, moving into more like real, grounded, practical, practicality in both thoughts and actions, because Mercury's thoughts and Mars is actions. So it looks like, we're going to be bringing all this passion and enthusiasm and like trying to make something real come about from it. And then we have moon transits. So there's going to be two big events for the moon in August. On August 11th, there's going to be a full moon in Capricorn or Makara. Whenever there's a full moon, it's sort of like a peak culmination of energy. So tend to, it can get very emotional, but things literally tend to kind of swell. Like you can even get more births and stuff like that. Like the energy in mothers swells, to deliver children. It's kind of interesting. Moon in Capricorn is in a neutral sign, so it does okay. And it's going to be aspecting Venus and Sun in its own sign of Cancer. So the moon is going to be really kind of dominating Venus and Sun, in the few days that it's aspecting its own sign. So again, we're going to bring this sort of practicality to emotionality. The other thing is that the moon, when it's in this full state, it's going to be in a nakshatra or lunar mansion called Dhanishta, and the symbol of Dhanishta is a drum. So whether you want to be more literal about it and think about like music, I always think about like rhythms and kind of bass, like, because usually the drum like keeps the pace, keeps the rhythm. And so because this is all happening in Capricorn, when you have a Swa retrograde Saturn in there, it's like you're bringing new rhythms to an establishment, established routines regarding like the home, is one way you could kind of take these energies. And then on August 31st, there's going to be a new moon in Leo or Simha. So when you have new moons, it's basically you're kind of finishing out, writing out old energies, releasing of old energies so that you can, head into the new lunar cycle. Moon in Leo is ruled by Sun, so it's a friendly sign. The moon does pretty well there. And it's going to conjoin Sun in its own sign with the Mars aspect. So that's going to make, the Sun's activities public, because the moon can symbolize public things. And it's going to be in the nakshatra of Maga. The symbol of Maga is a throne. So it's like, okay, now we're back to this again. I kept kind of trying to get away from like government, but it kept coming up in the energies this month. So, again, we'll see. But so the Maga Nakshatra, the main star of Maga is Regulus, which is considered the heart of Leo. So it can symbolize things like courage. This is also the star in Vedic Astrology that's considered where like our ancestors, when they pass, they go to reside up in the sky. So it can represent like lineages, and again, Leo ruled by the sun, so diplomacy, royalty, it can be ambition, because again, Leo, sun's a fiery energy, ceremony, heads of organizations, government, history, tradition. So Yeah, we're back to. I was trying to kind of get away from it, but I felt like I kept kind of getting, drawn into looking at, potential changes in the government. So there may be, again, new kind of public awareness or public announcements related to government and heads of state moving forward. So we'll see. So there you have it. Looking at the transits coming up in August. I hope that you found this helpful and interesting. And again, just be a little bit careful. Just the charts that I shared doesn't necessarily mean that these things will play out for you in similar ways, because everybody has a different natal position of their planets and they're going through different planetary periods. And so again, the most meaningful interpretation of transits is when you are actually looking also at the natal position of things and planetary periods of time and places and people and stuff like that. So I hope that you found this as enlightening as I do with Vedic astrology. Until the next one, take care. Bye-bye.